Hello and welcome to this episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. I am speaking this week with regular contributor Emily Kornheiser, who's one of three reps from the town of Brattleboro, as well as Lieutenant Governor candidate David Zuckerman. Hello, David.
Hello, Olga. And I don't know if you go by Rep Kornheiser or Emily. What do you prefer?
I go by Emily. That's why it's after my pronouns there, David, on my little thing. Good to see you.
I didn't read that far.
It's a lot. It's a lot.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't renamed my Zoom room since the session ended. So
all good.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, Emily. No worries.
All those little details we must remember. So for folks who maybe haven't tuned into the show recently, just FYI, Emily and I are hoping to talk to as many candidates as we can before the Vermont primary on August 9th. Although just a public service reminder, early voting has started, so you can request a ballot from your town clerk or through the Secretary of State's office if you would like to vote absentee or vote early. On that note, David, we're going to kick off with a question that I'm asking everyone who comes on this show who's a candidate, which is, of all the ways you can serve your community, you know, you're a farmer, you have served in the House, in the Senate, previously as Lieutenant Governor. Why choose elected service as your way to serve your community?
I like that question. I think it's choosing one way. But it's not the only way. And probably when you talk with each candidate, I would think and hope that we would all mention that we serve our community in multiple ways, whether it's volunteer fire squad, a local commission. There's a lot of committees in towns that are not elected but appointed. There's just the way you help a neighbor out of a ditch is part of helping your community. So I think we all do it in various ways. But the reason, I guess, that I would like to go back into public service in an elected form position is because I've seen what one can do. I've seen the scale of impact of what one can do. And it's an interesting role being either in the legislature as lieutenant governor, because there's rarely a moment in time where you go, that's when the change happened. That's when the impact occurred. On the other hand, and I've often made this metaphorical connection with farming, you do this ongoing effort. You tend the soil, you water the plants, you talk about the issues, you work with your community as well as your colleagues to build the moment for that opportunity to then make something happen. So things like medical aid and dying. It took me 9 years of effort from when I introduced the bill to when that became law. And many people were organizing around marriage equality for a long time. And as a policymaker, I worked on that for many years, introduced a bill in 2005. It wasn't until 2008 that we got marriage equality. But the scale of what you can do, and I think it's important to think about the scale on both sides of the equation here, from the micro local level, where in the grocery store you have a conversation with someone or you help someone reach the top shelf and you help in your community, to the larger scale of policy making, where sometimes you help more people at once, but it's not as direct. It's not right there with the person. All have an important impact. And I want to tell a brief story of one moment I was in public service, but it had nothing to do with the policies that were happening. I was fortunate enough to go to a lieutenant governor meeting, and I met a lieutenant governor who had put Braille on their business card. And I thought, how did I not think of this after 18 years, 19 years of being a legislator, trying to be inclusive? I completely missed that opportunity. And I said to myself immediately, when I get home, this was right after I'd been elected lieutenant governor the first time in 2016, I'm going to make sure, in fact, I think I texted it to Meg, my incoming chief of staff. When you order the business cards, get them in Braille. This is unbelievably important. And I went to the Tunbridge Fair a year later, and I was in the building with the old-timey candle making and the piano player and the old post office there. And the piano player was an older blind woman. And I was introducing myself to her, and I was chatting with her about a few things, and I was getting ready to leave. And I said, "Oh, let me give you my business card." And I could see she was sort of like, what is the point of giving me a business card? Just the energy in her face and her body was like, are you a jerk or an idiot? Like, what's going on here? And I gave her the card. And that's one of, there's probably 3 or 4 moments I could list in my 20 years where it just was so powerful to see the impact of the work. I gave her my card, and the second she felt it, I could see her whole body shift and the energy in her face shift, and observing the sense of being included in a way that she had never been included before. That a political person was making it possible for her to have that contact information in a way that she, just being included, I guess, is it's so simple and yet so important. And so if in my elected service, either directly with people in that instance where I saw that impact, or indirectly with people that can marry their loved ones, or family members who get to be with their loved ones in a compassionate moment at the end of life. And I've been told about some of these, but there's many more that I don't know. They happen now. That's what drives me to continue in public service, is to be able to make change that impacts people, whether they know that I was involved or not, but is important changes that occur for our lives.
Thank you, David. We would really appreciate that. And it's something Emily and I have talked about on the show a lot, about how do we get as many people at the table as possible. And we want to dive into a segment of climate change, which again is one of those conversations of how do we move forward with responding to climate change and making sure communities don't get left behind, specifically rural communities. And I think I'm hoping that this conversation is near and dear to your heart as a farmer.
Very much.
Because
Yeah.
one of the questions we need to ask is, how do we make our food system, and in many cases our local food system, more resilient in given the changes that are happening with climate change? And I'd love to hear from you, when you look out from your perspective now, what are the holes in our policy that you think need to be filled so that we can make our food system more resilient
And
to climate change?
If I could just sort of add some context for this, David, because as I was thinking about this question before we got on the show today, I was thinking about my district specifically, which is, it's just a third of Brattleboro. I think people have a certain perspective of what Brattleboro is and isn't. But my district, almost a third of it is folks who live in 2 affordable housing communities. And that is one that is sort of a resident managed housing trust property that looks sort of like condos. It's sort of like 2-level, densely populated. There are lawns, but they're really tiny lawns. And then across the street is the largest cooperative mobile home park in the state. And so that's a third of my district. And then the rest of my district is really all dirt roads with fairly, large plots of property. It's a mix of enormous second homes, trailers, sort of everything you see on a dirt road in Vermont. And there are 2 farms in the district. One longtime family farm, Lilac Ridge, the Thurbers. Another one, Rebop, young, really dynamic hill farm, first generation. And then there's some properties that are sort of on the edge, were once farms, like Hamilton Farm, who are sort of transitioning their land into something else because dairy wasn't working for them anymore. And so when I think about food access, I think about, and resiliency and climate change, I think about the flooding that is still impacting from Irene in this mobile home park in the state. They are still impacted by the residue of Irene. And I think about the idea of the farmers at Rebop ever being able to sell the produce to the folks who are living sort of across the street, basically, from them. And so when we talk about this, I want to talk about really specifically about like what it actually means for farmers to actually make a living, because I know a lot of farmers on food stamps, and the climate impacts of all this, like down the hill. It is actually like a hill farm. And then there's the downstream real effect of the folks at the bottom of the hill ever being able to buy this food. So like, that's where I'm starting for this conversation.
Yeah. So, and we only have an hour or now?
We only have an hour. And we're going to have some like fun little forays and other topics along the way.
Well, because I mean, so much of what you're talking about is the reality of, and I get tired of the use of the word intersectionality, but the range of ways that our society and our systems are broken. Because I would argue, have an economic system that is broken. And that economic system that is broken impacts people in where they live and how they live and the food they can eat. That economic system includes our healthcare system or not such system that creates the economic disparities and also the unhealthy outcomes. Fortunately, up where I live in Heinsberg, I now have, I think, 8 or 9 shares that are health shares that are purchased by the UVM Medical Center for clients of theirs that they see regularly, that they feel if they had better diets would actually greatly improve and reduce the frequency of their hospital situations. So there's these little teeny microscopic experiments that are starting, such as this one with the hospital.
And there's, if you're on WIC or now even on food stamps, there are these really great coupons at the farmer's market that at one point it was like you'd get $10 a summer and you'd be like, you're just trying to lure me into your like.
Now it's $10 a week. Yeah.
But now it's really like it's like really a doubling of your food stamps at the market. Yes. Enough to make
crop cash. And we accept that at our farm. And then there's also farm to family, which is part of the WIC program. So there's different with EBT, you can take 10 EBT dollars and turn into $20 worth of farmers market food coupons and tokens. So Vermont is doing things, nonprofits are doing things. We're making, I think, more steps here. They're still nibbling around the edges of the broader economic systemic problems. And I'm glad we're sort of trying to put these different Band-Aids on, but so I don't want to knock them. I think they're good progress. They're still the broader systemic issues, and we can go down that direction. But I think I'll pause on that direction for a moment with respect to food and farms and both access to food in terms of volume, as well as access to food economically at a price that farmers can afford to do it. And I'm fortunate. The land we bought, we were able to purchase at the same time as a land trust purchase happened. So I didn't have to buy it at full market value in Chittenden County because there's no way we could have paid off the debt with carrots and cabbages and so forth. And it's still a struggle, but we make a living. Unlike most farmers, my taxes are extraordinarily public. So you can look up the years that I've done well and not well based on my campaign filings. But I would say that in terms of as a system, and I had thought of an idea a couple of years ago when I was running for governor, that with some of the COVID money, what if we had worked to help fund basically like the old Apple co-ops, but food vegetable storage co-ops, because we have many, many farms that are starting up, like you said, I think is it Rebop or is that what they're called? That not only have to buy equipment and seeds and fertilizer and cover crop seeds and figure out how to farm well and then figure out the pricing and make a living doing it. Storing food is not inexpensive. You got to put in an insulated room that is rodent proof, and you've got to get cooling systems and conditioning systems. So many smaller farms have the ability to put in a small refrigerator space where they harvest the food each day, they cool it, and the next day or two, they move that out. And then they have space again for that next small harvest. Not so many farms have the kind of capacity I have, which is in late October, early November, maybe 120 to 140,000 pounds of food worth of storage, to having taken over an old dairy barn and over 20 years added 4 storage rooms. But there's an expense to that, and there's an inefficiency to that. If we had community storage, either every town or every 3 or 4 towns, where small farms that are growing 2 acres of vegetables, but they have the equipment and the land to grow more, but not storage, if they suddenly had a place they could take their larger storage crops and aggregate it in storage with 6 other local farms, then the storage capacity and the food resilience capacity that we would have would increase. And I want to put this into some context. When COVID started, we probably had about 20 to 25,000 pounds of food left. It was March. So November to March, I had sold much of my food. That food disappeared so fast. Remember, the no toilet paper, but also there were plenty of food, limiting factors. So stores bought my food very quickly. And it made me think about the fact that here in Chittenden County, at my peak storage with 120 to 130,000 pounds of food, I still had less than 1 pound of food for every resident of Chittenden County for one day at my peak storage in November. And so when I think about food resiliency in a very uncertain climate and economic and social unrest time period, we are woefully inadequately prepared. And to think that farms could independently build the storage capacity to get us to a place where we would have 2 or 3 months of food for every resident of Vermont, or even 6 months of food, which is, would be truly much more resilient. We are light years from that. Furthermore, if you aggregated food from 6 or 8 farms and they cooperatively then also marketed and distributed their food, you could have one delivery truck doing the delivery that 10 different trucks or 6 different trucks are doing almost identical routes. So from a climate perspective and a time perspective, that's absurd. So
down here, we have a program called Food Connects, which I think is now working statewide, but was founded down here as part of a climate resiliency project. It came out of Post Oil Solutions. And what's been really cool, especially through COVID, as more and more farm stores have grown during that time where people really didn't want to go to the grocery store, and have now sort of created habits of going to farm stores. They're not just picking up farms and distributing it to the grocery store, they're also distributing it to other farms. So each of the farm stores in our area has the products of each other's farm, which means that farmers can diversify in a much more significant way than I've seen until now. And that's been really, really exciting.
And what you mean, let me just clarify what you mean by diversified. So their stands can be more diversified, but they don't necessarily have to grow every single crop.
Exactly. And so what I've often been frustrated by, just as like a totally bougie food consumer, like, why does everyone grow the exact same 8 vegetables in this town? And it's because those are the 8 vegetables that people most want to buy. But if they're all selling each other's goods, it really means that they can sort of specialize and we can have a more diverse set of crops across the board, which is great for new Americans. It's great for bougie food consumers like me. And it means that as, blights come and go, as climate changes, we're going to have farmers that are much more nimble in crops that they pick up and put down.
And it also means as farms specialize. I mean, one of the reasons when we look at our food system in this country, that you have a lot of farms that grow 1 to 5 crops, is from a cost of production perspective. It can be far easier to manage, far fewer specialized pieces of equipment. And so you use the specialized equipment 25 hours or 50 hours a week instead of for 1 hour a week, and then a different piece for 2 hours a week. So you can also create a better price point for the consumers. So some of the things that maybe are a bit bougie can become maybe a little bit more accessible to a wider range of people. And sometimes it's not just bougie, it's actually a food that might have a different nutrition profile. that is also really important for our health. I've often,
Radicchio is very good for you.
there you go.
Yes,
I don't have
there
to
we
grow
go.
radicchio, but because it's a bit of a specialized thing, and we actually grow about 60 different crops and have pigs and chickens and eggs on our farm, chickens for meat and chickens for eggs. So we are one of those farms that has become sort of ridiculously diversified. But that's partly because we are 70% direct to consumer, whether it's the farmers market or CSA. And so having that range has been a competitive advantage because someone can come and pick and choose the range of things that they like. But also what we've done on our farm is maybe different and or more possible because of our scale. But I know that at the farmers market, I have my prices where they need to be in order to try and pay my employees at least closer to a livable wage. Everybody's over $15 an hour plus food, but these days that's barely getting people by. Trying to treat the soil and the water well, which is typically a more expensive way to farm, and trying to keep my price points where people can obtain the food. And so what, in talking with some very businessy people, they said, charge what you can get for the food and then make the adjustment on an individual scale. So we were talking earlier about crop cash or the farm to family coupons and things like that. As someone comes up to my checkout and I'm tallying their food and I see what they're pulling out of their pocket or their wallet or their purse, as I do the math and come to the tally, for those that I know it's a little harder, I can knock 20% off, 30% off. I might not even make any profit on that sale, but because I make sure I'm charging enough to make my farm be able to operate, doing that 15 or 30 times in a farmer's market is a piece of community service. This goes back to your original question, Olga, actually, of the little things we do that sometimes people don't even know, because I just say a number to my customers. I'm quickly tallying on a scale. I'm running numbers in my head and I'm like 37.25, 16.40, whatever it is. And for them, I go 10.50, or whatever.
I think that's so interesting. Like, I think that's really beautiful from a community connection. We're all taking care of each other. We're in relationship with each other.
But from a systemic level.
Oh, it doesn't do anything for the systemic problem.
From a systemic level, I talk a lot, especially Steph from Public Assets and I talk about this a lot. And it's something that Doug Hoffer actually created, one of the most eloquent charts I've ever seen. I mean, I'm sure Doug didn't make it, but someone in his shop made this incredibly eloquent chart. Sorry, Doug. About basically the fact that we have these incredibly simple systems for the wealthy and these incredibly complex systems for the poor, right? And so the accountability that's required to get your discount if you're poor, you have to, go to the food stamp office and fill out the forms and get the things and then go get the tokens, and the tokens are only in increments of whatever, not whatever, and you don't have this nimbleness. And then if you're wealthy, you're just like, throwing the cash out the door and you're not waiting for the farmer to come up with a new number. And that part is like, or even as a parent applying for financial aid for a program, I have to give the program all of my financial information. The wealthy person does not have to share. So it's like, who gets privacy, who doesn't get privacy, all of that. And so we're not really talking about climate yet, but we are talking about the folks who are most impacted by climate, which we know is, poor folks and folks of color. And so as we come up with solutions, which I think we all agree that one of the solutions to climate change is these more resilient, more localized farm systems. I want to come up with a system that meets the needs of poor folks in Vermont.
Yeah. So a few things. I mean,
including the farmers.
Including the farmers, yes.
Well, I did mention this co-op storage model.
Yeah.
That's a piece of a system change. I have also mentioned to other people at times that I think universal health care would actually be a systemic change in agriculture, because many people who want to farm or work on farms choose not to because it's not secure. It's not a pathway. There's no path in health in farming that ever gets you healthcare. There's almost no farms I know of. I mean, maybe Paul Harlow does, I don't know, but you've got to be at such a scale to be able to offer health benefits, right? And so I think of universal healthcare as being a systemic change that would actually help our farming and system, because there's a lot of people that want to be farmers or work on farms, and it's just not an option for them. I talked recently quite a bit about, although I've talked about it for a long time too, the whole trickle-down Reaganomics and neoliberal economic philosophy, which is that wealthy people should pay lower and lower taxes, and somehow that will create an economy that works for everybody. We've had 40 plus years of that failing, and our wealth and income distribution has only just become a wider and wider. Got to make it fit on the thing.
And then we had like a month of trying something else, and it worked so well, and we have stopped doing it. Right? Like we had a month of like distributing money to everyone at the bottom, and we saw it worked. Our economy thrived, and for some reason we have stopped doing that.
Yeah.
Short memories.
Well, short memories, and I don't even know that a lot of people know how or why that happened. Right. So Vermont, and I walked into the buzzsaw in my campaign 2 years ago with the governor, but people give him a lot of credit, and I think he was stable and rational and reasonable and did a fine job. But he's also a small government governor who would never raise funds to do something like that. But when the small state minimum at the federal level, and Senator Leahy in particular on approach, but our whole delegation brought us in $600 million extra dollars, not $600 million in the first bill. It was $1.4 billion that Vermont got. By the formula, we would have gotten about $800 million. And then we had an extra $600 million. So that afforded, and I talked actually to a woman whose name I don't remember from down your way, the Business Alliance person who owned restaurants both
Bethany
in Vermont.
Bonin.
Yes.
Bonin. Someday I'll remember.
Here in Colorado, and she said the scale of the business grants was night and day. Here, much bigger, Colorado, much smaller. The financial supports for Vermonters, both with the federal money that was distributed all across the country, but also in these little ways at the state level, was a massive influx of funding from the federal level. Now, one of the reasons I don't think we could necessarily continue that is Vermont, even with taxing wealthy people more, we couldn't generate the kind of money to hand out, and handout's not a good phrase, to distribute resources to people in that way. On the other hand, we could make systemic changes. Another piece, and some of those changes could be having to do with the hoops you have to jump through to get those supports that Emily was talking about. The stigma, the embarrassment, and even just the time struggle. I mean, if you're a single person raising a couple kids and you're working 55, 60 hours a week, and you have to go to the office that's 12 miles away, and these hurdles are not easy.
Well, here's another Band-Aid, actually, speaking of Stephanie, Olga.
One quick, we're out of time, so just one quick Band-Aid and metaphor, and then we need to go to break.
Take a break.
Okay.
So at the Everyone Eats program, which actually started down here in Brattleboro, local farms provide food for local restaurants to cook into meals that are handed out to everyone regardless of income status. And so if you are a tired middle-class parent, you can pick up a free meal. And if you are a single person living in poverty, you can pick up a free meal. It doesn't matter why you're showing up. You're just saying, I need some food today. And that circle, I think, is a really powerful one, both for stigma and for supporting local farms and businesses. Olga.
Thank you. So stay tuned, everyone. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return in a moment. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. If you are just joining us, I am your host, Olga Peters, and I am speaking with regular contributor, Representative Emily Kornheiser, and Lieutenant Governor candidate David Zuckerman. So glad you can both be here today. If you're looking for the happy hour, you can find us on BCTV, our podcast, Emily's YouTube channel, as well as our Facebook page and our Captivate page. Just look for the Montpelier Happy Hour. Emily, what do we need to remind people of?
Well, as a matter of fact, the views and opinions expressed here on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the host and the guests individually, and not of the radio station, TV station, employer, friends, or farm animals of those people expressing their opinions.
So, David,
Yeah.
we were talking before the break about some of the policies around food access, and Emily pointed out beautifully how so often food access for people of lower income is just very complicated with programs like food stamps or crop cash. But I want to shift the conversation a little bit and focus in on climate change and how that has been impacting farming in Vermont, and how do we really strengthen farms given the changes and the fact that we may lose some of the crops that are precious to us, such as maple syrup. How, as a farmer, what are you sitting with? What are you looking at? Where do we need to go?
Well,
If I could add one more thing there, because I was really surprised early in my time as a legislator. I was hosting a climate panel down here, and I invited a local farmer to be on it, Abby Course, from Course Family Farm. And she said, like, are the environmentalists going to come for me? Like, she was really nervous about coming, like more nervous than Matt Coda, who I invited to, and who Coda and Coda fuel dealer. Like, if someone's going to be nervous at a climate event, it should be Matt, not Abby, right? So, and she was just like, the cows and the farts and like people coming for me about that is like really, and she pretty much like devotes, she was on the climate council. She devotes her work to really like farming in a way that's climate protective and resilient. So it was really like the farmer as the enemy in this conversation, I think is an important one to weave in as we go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll toot my horn for half a second, but as Lieutenant Governor involved with the appointments of the Senate to the Climate Council, I helped be the lead on getting Abby Course on the Climate Council.
Thank you. I don't think she'll ever forgive you for that because she actually had a terrible time on the Climate Council.
Oh no,
that's not your fault.
So sad, because such a valuable,
very valuable voice,
asset of knowledge and experience and perspective, which is exactly what you were just talking about. Is as a farmer, there's no doubt food and production of food has an impact on our planet, not just climate wise, but soil, water, and so forth. And I remember when I was on the ag committee in the legislature many years ago, at least 10, if not 15 years ago, talking about climate. And some farmers said, hey, sometimes we're getting a fourth cut of hay now. We only used to get 3. So they considered it potentially a benefit. Now, I tend to think that we always should be thinking a little more long-term than short-term. So there may be a short-term benefit for some dairies that could harvest a fourth cut of hay, but really in the bigger picture, what are the impacts and are they good or bad? So, but it was an interesting perspective to hear during the conversation. I can say that yesterday, as we were distributing our CSA food, one of my members, last week I got a kohlrabi that had kind of a hard core in it. And that's pretty unusual. What happened? I said, well, first of all, feel free to take a replacement kohlrabi this week. But secondly, which is an interesting thing, right? As a farm, you can never know that every single piece is going to be perfect. I mean, I've bought plenty of avocados. You open them and on the inside, they're like nasty. You don't get to go, can you replace the avocado? But just
I actually do that at our co-op. I will.
Okay.
Well, but anyway,
good on you. But as it's a shifting dynamic. But anyway, I try to make it right. But I said, I don't honestly know. The only thing I could think of is some brassicas and some crops, they've got their vegetative stage and then they have a reproductive stage. And normally it's a bit later than now that a kohlrabi would consider changing to putting up a seed stalk and a flowering stalk. In fact, I've almost never had a kohlrabi do that. And yet somehow internally that kohlrabi had started doing its metamorphosis to create that core in the way that a second-year carrot has a very woody core because it's actually putting up a seed stock. And I was wondering, as this season has been particularly temperature variant, 90 degrees, 40 degrees, 92 degrees, 43 degrees, within days of each other, and not just once, but up and down and up and down. I don't yet know what all the impacts are going to be on some of the crops, but this has never happened in my kohlrabi before. I've never had that feedback. We've got sunflowers that normally would not have flowered yet. The plant would have gotten bigger and they would create flowers that are 8 to 10 inches in diameter. And our whole first planting, we're cutting sunflowers that are 2.5 to 3 inches in diameter. So some sort of stress has said, go to reproductive mode, because plants very much, when you think about flowers or fruits on plants, that is their reproductive methodology. And so if they're stressed, they are going to go into reproduction mode more than vegetative mode.
Like all those pandemic babies. Something
like that, indeed. Maybe plants are more sentient than we know. But speaking of me being earlier, I think you mentioned hippie farmer. There you go. This will get used against me someday in some place, but who knows? Anyway, I'm joking because it's just the absurdity of politics sometimes. So for us, what I've seen the last few years was much longer dry spells in June. And it really was stressful because as it got warmer and I was running my ponds down for irrigation, we hadn't even gotten to July and August, which are typically hot. And then at some point, finally, we got like a 2-inch rain and I was sort of saved by the bell, but it was very stressful. And certainly the crops don't grow as well with irrigation as rain. This year, we've had a pretty good balance, but I was just talking to a friend of mine down your way that said it's been pretty bone dry.
I saw square bales in the field yesterday in June. No one does square bales in June.
Right. And so,
like that's not a safe way to.
I mean, it's just extremely, and if it's been that dry, I know in the past few years, you've had phenomenally wet years.
Yes. When you had a drought last year, we all had just drowning in mold.
And food is rotting and you got no food when it's too wet. I mean, I've always said I'll take drier over wetter, but full on drought, at some point I'm going to run out of water too.
Yeah.
So, but too wet is almost impossible. So the climate is definitely impacting food production. And one of the reasons actually to be moderately diverse as a farm is because different plants are going to react differently. So for 24 years that I've been farming, 23 years or whatever it is that I've had my own farm, having a diverse set of crops means 3 to 5 do overabundant, 3 to 5 don't do well. I was going to say something the bed, but I can't say that. But do very poorly, and most do average. But with the climate shifting the way it is, it'll be interesting to see how many more crops are going to do what the kohlrabi did. We have a couple crops that didn't germinate well because we did have a couple of dry weeks during sort of early planting of some crops. And we tried to irrigate, but it's just not the same. So the climate is definitely, and then there's the longer term issues like you talked about, Olga, with maple. And I would say forestry in general, we're going to see a shift in what types of trees we have in our woods. And for years, I thought I was going to bring up some black walnut seed from my mom's place in Virginia and plant them here thinking, okay, 80 and 150 years from now, when they're maturing, this will be their climate and maybe sooner. I never did do that. And now that's not a possibility. So I'm sad, but the landscape is going to change. The wild plants are going to change. So your foraging is going to change. Your mushroom species might change. The climate change is profound with respect to what it's going to do. And on the one hand, most people aren't going to notice because we have a food system, if we're talking systems, that imports food from all over the world or thousands of miles away.
Right. We can get bananas regardless of of what's happening here.
That's right.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we just had a touch of what the disruption can mean when COVID started. And even now with many things like my 2 months of repairs on my box truck that haven't finished because parts aren't coming in, our food system is going to face that same situation. California, I think about a third of the vegetable land is not being planted. And if you look at the price of food in stores, literally just this morning, Rachel said to me that yesterday at CSA pickup after I had left, some folks came by and said, well, what's the price on some of these things? And she told them, and they said, that's cheaper than at the store. And then she said, and it's organic. And they said, are you kidding me? So the price of food has skyrocketed, as many people know, just like everything else, and particularly in the vegetable arena. And yet, if we have more local food production, we can actually temper that variation in the supply chain.
So those are the impacts. That's how farms are going to be both help us be more resilient and sort of suffer the impacts. What is the role of farmers in actually mitigating?
The role of what?
What is the role of farmers in preventing climate change or in lowering?
Actually, yeah, there's I think agriculture and land management is one of the biggest ways to positively impact what could happen. And that has to do with cover cropping and carbon sequestration. You know, I could come up with this machine that will take carbon out of the air. And I walk outside and go, the machines are here. It's called nature. It's called grasses and trees. Grasses, actually, big grasses and even hemp can grow more and pull carbon out of the air faster than certain age trees. Younger and middle-aged trees actually sequester more carbon than older trees because they're growing faster, right? So a baby or a teenager consumes a lot more calories than maybe any of the three of us do. Although as a farmer, maybe I am an outlier, but we don't need
to talk about each of our individual calories consumption.
There we go. But the point is that when growing fast, the intake is much greater. And so teenage plants and young plants are going to sequester a lot more carbon. So if we have more cover cropping, if we had government systems which now do start to incentivize cover cropping, then we can start to pull carbon out of the air in a way that would help lower the CO2. There's a movie called Kiss the Ground that's got some really amazing video imagery of satellite imagery of the level of carbon dioxide release around the planet. And in the Northern Hemisphere in the springtime, when farms are tilling bazillions of acres all across our food belt of the Midwest, the amount of carbon that's being released into the atmosphere with that soil agitation just by light years overwhelms any other form of production for those month of massive field cultivation. So finding ways to till our soil less. Well, what's interesting as someone who's had huge concerns around GMOs and working with many people down in your way. I mean, there's a lot of GMO interest in Brattleboro and in Windham County and across the state, obviously, with the bills we passed. GMOs, there's a lot of dairies now using GMO corn. They're almost all using GMO corn. They're now growing rye. You see the cover crops in the fall and the spring. You see the corn starting to come up through it. And then you see the rye go from green to brown over the course of a week, which is not what it would normally do. That's killed with an herbicide. But the corn is GMO to resist the herbicide, which is glyphosate typically. And then you've got this 1 foot corn with no weeds around it. And the farmers have had to jump on the weeds and they are disturbing the soil less. They're doing no-till agriculture. So I talked to one farm that said they added nearly 1% of organic matter to their soil over the last decade. And for anybody who farms, adding 1% organic matter in 10 years is an almost unbelievable feat. But they've done it using some technologies that I'm not a huge fan of, and with widespread glyphosate use and impacts on our soil and water. So trying to figure out, and there are a lot of organic farms doing research on how to grow organic crops without as much cultivation equipment, because that's how we kill weeds, is hoeing and cultivating the soil. So there's a lot that farmers are experimenting with and doing to disturb soil less, to sequester carbon out of the air and into the soil, that I think are part of the future. They also cost money, right? And so when we talk about systems and we talk about governance, individual farms who are competing with every other farmer out there to sell their product in a world that has got this, or a US world that has this downward price pressure on everything, what gets squeezed out is the environmental, capacity to do it the right way.
What I think about when you say that is, in debates about family medical leave or minimum wage increases or fair wages, I think a lot of what we talk about is that when we create a regulatory structure that prizes that sort of enforces a higher minimum standard, what that means is that the businesses that have always been doing good by their employees or have always done good by the environment are not penalized in the market against a business that hasn't. And so if we create a higher environmental threshold for farms or a higher, while supporting farms to make that transition, the farms that have always been doing that aren't in a negative competitive position with farms who have been needed in some way to operate on sort of a lowest common denominator basis. And that's a really sort of, that involves dollars and state dollars, but it also is a regulatory mechanism. And I think it's really important that, especially in the case of farms, we pair those two things always. We pair technical assistance, regulatory expertise, and financial support so that farmers can make that transition in a way that they have the dollars to make that transition, they have the expertise they need to make that transition, but they also have that regulatory pressure so that those who are interested in doing this aren't unfairly penalized in the marketplace.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with tying all those things together. And when we go back to minimum wage or affordable housing, it's also making sure consumers have the resources to then buy those products at the price that includes the full range of the impacts of the production of the product.
Mm-hmm.
In Germany, manufacturers have to include in the price of products that they sell the cost of disposal of not only the product, but the packaging. And so if you're in Germany, you'll find that the amount of packaging around everything that you buy is phenomenally less than what we have here, where the package is big to make you feel like you're getting a lot, and then inside there's so much less, or all the extra foam or all these extra materials. And so if we apply that in the farming world or in every aspect of our lives, when we think about the amount of waste we create, businesses, it's interesting. Businesses and creative minds and farmers or business people will find ways to meet the standard. And they will find creative ways that are both more environmentally sound because the standard requires it, and more economically reasonable because they're going to go, okay, I could be doing it the right way environmentally, one way that costs more money, one way that costs less, and I'm going to find the most efficient way to do it. We are, in our nature and in this country's economic models, we are very efficiency, minded, but we still have to set the bar. And that's what you were just talking about. Yeah.
In addition to setting the bar, I think if we have a robust extension service or something like a robust extension service, when one farmer in one corner of the state is able to innovate based on that regulatory mechanism, that innovation can be passed to a farmer in another corner of the state that they might not necessarily have time to connect with on their own.
Exactly. And we may be running low on time, so I want to show you something that I had Rachel bring me when you were talking about the happy hour beverage that you sometimes create. My brother married a Romanian, and I had the good fortune to go to Romania, and I think it was 2019, many years ago. We're getting older. And in Romania, when the pear trees start just setting their fruit after flowering, they put bottles on the tree over the fruit.
Oh my goodness.
And so this is a pear in a bottle, and it fits perfectly with the shape of the bottle because it grows right there. And then they put their homemade whatever it is.
Like Slivovitz kind
moonshine.
of thing.
It is a moonshine kind of beverage. And I have taken like the smallest sips over 20 years out of this because it's a very amazing flavor, but also it is knock your head off. So I don't really want to drink much of it, but I also want to preserve it. So, but anyway, kind of a cool little
That
thing.
is cool.
So just for
Oh,
ideas.
I would, Scott Farm has started to do more and more. They're doing cider making, but I think they're also thinking about moving into distilling. And I bet
They
would
need
be
to
really
know about that.
excited about that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So in any case, I want to get that in before the end because it's kind of fun. But systemically, to me, if we want a sustainable food system and one that, and by sustainable food system, I mean supply, I mean at a price people can afford and environmentally sustainable and climately better and employee and worker better.
Mhm.
That we do not have a system for that right now.
Mhm.
We do not have an economic system or a regulatory system that is setting us on that path. We have to have that conversation with many farmers and many economists and others. But earlier I mentioned universal health care. Emily, you brought up paid family medical leave, and or I think we may or may not have mentioned childcare. All of these pieces of our economic system are part of the farming climate resilient impact reality.
Absolutely.
And so I just wanted to bring that in that as long as we sort of try to go, oh, we have to deal with this piece of the pie. And I'm not claiming you do this. I'm sort of more the way politics works is we're going to do a bill about this one thing. We really miss the systemic aspect of it all.
And to be clear, this isn't just about folks having sort of the economic capacity to be able to afford locally grown products. It's also so farmers can make it work. And
Right.
so even when we talk about sort of paperwork thresholds, I know a lot of farmers trying to apply for childcare subsidy, trying to apply for food stamps, trying to declare your income in a tidy way as a farmer is impossible.
Right.
There are even separate forms in the food stamp office for it. We could maybe just simplify everything and not have separate forms for it. And so it's about both having everyone's economic livelihood have a solid enough foundation that we can buy from our neighbors, but it's also the folks who are creating those products having a solid enough foundation that they feel stable doing the work.
So I'm going to jump in here because we're getting low on time, and I have a second question I want to ask every candidate. It's kind of in this vein. It's a great segue. You talk about all these different policies and different levers that need to be pulled, David. Where do you feel is the first policy change that needs to start the domino effect that you feel would make Vermont work better for everybody?
Let's see. It's interesting. I sort of just, I hate these kinds of what's the top thing or the priority because
they're evil.
Describing the web of how they're interconnected. So where in the web is the most important part of a web, right? And I guess I would either say, and Emily would actually know this arena well, but I also served on the committee, tax policy.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I say that is there's been a lot of discussion in my race actually about balancing the budget and passing budgets that are balanced. I would argue, yes, passing a budget that's balanced means not spending more money than you have. But we've passed budgets that are balanced that underfund weatherization, underfund technical and financial assistance for farms, underfund school maintenance and buildings and infrastructure, underfund mental health care, underfund. So they're balanced.
Mm-hmm.
We don't spend more money than we have, but they're balanced on the backs of everybody who is not getting by in society and or deferring all the maintenance, like our pension funds for 40 years.
And what they do is they underfund programs, initiatives, government that will actually save us money in the long run, even.
100%. And then there's the side of all that paperwork you talked about, Emily, which is all about accountability and not wasting any money. And yet I would argue the amount of money that is spent doing the paperwork and entering all that paperwork is probably more costly both to government and to people's time and the way they could be productive than any money that was wasted in a system that gave away services or resources to a few people that weren't supposed to, and I do these things in air quotes, get. So to me, back to your question, it's the resource side. It's taxes. Because we're not going to build these collective food cooperative, or at least give grants to help build them, if we don't have the money to do it. We're not going to have universal health care without the money to do it. We're not going to on and on and on. So if we shifted our tax policy in a way that was much more community minded and much more progressive and much of a reverse of the Reaganomic neoliberal topic that I talked about from the very beginning, and had an economy from the bottom up, I think that would have profound changes across many of these issues. But if you want an actual sort of policy of governance, I think the next one would be universal health care. Because the shift in what people would be able to do and how they could participate in their communities or the society economically or their families, the number of people that go bankrupt is driven largely in financial health bankruptcy. If we look at mental health and people's stresses that they've accumulated over time with economic duress, if we lowered that stress with universal health care, that would be it would be impactful over time in so many ways. And then housing, I mean,
you got one and you're on your third now.
I know, but you hadn't cut me off yet, so I kept going. There, I'll stop. There you go.
I'm laughing because I know you guys said that question is evil, but I like it, especially as a reporter, because it's so easy. I think sometimes when we're talking about policy, as much as I agree everything's a web and interconnected, it's also easy when you say, oh, everything's a web, everything's interconnected, to then kind of gloss over the actual action steps that need to happen to keep that web whole. And so I love it. And you did give some great answers, but we are also out of time.
Yeah, and I hope my web example didn't mean I was trying to avoid the answer. I then hopefully went specific enough for you.
No, you were brilliant, David. Thank you. So, David, if people want to learn more about you and your campaign as Lieutenant Governor, where can they go?
Zuckerman4VT.com in the bottom of that lawn sign, which is now all over the state. But Zuckerman4VT.com, and they can learn my history of work in the legislature and as Lieutenant Governor, as well as send an email to info@Zuckerman4VT.com if they have specific questions. Of course, I'm also on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, or you could see me at the farmer's market or handing out carrots in parades.
Thank you, David. Emily, if people want to learn more about the work you're doing, where can they go?
Folks can go to emilykornheiser.org, where you'll find links to all the socials and my email and all of those other things. I'm also hosting an event on the Brattleboro Town Common for all of the statewide candidates, as well as our Senate candidates, every other Wednesday throughout the primary season. And looking forward to seeing folks at the 4th of July parade and at Gallery Walk. So lots of fun going on around here in Brattleboro lately.
What time of day is your Wednesday event?
You have lots of emails about it, but it's from 5 to 7.
Okay. My team has those, so thank you.
Yes, they might be keeping them a secret from you. Anyway, thanks for a great show, David. Thank you, Olga.
Thank you so much. Hey,
Thanks,
everyone. Stay tuned. Next week, we will be back with another candidate here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. And cheers.